I love anime, but what I really love is manga. Looking back on all of my favorite animation, much of it originated as a manga or a comic. With, the big exception. And some adaptations of our favorite comics were not what we fans were hoping for. I know you Berserk fans can relate. Fortunately, manga is a fairly reliable medium with a lot of quality control and even more competition, where the vast majority of IPs are original and not sequels or continuations of past stories. Unfortunately, unlike the comic book industry for example, this means that your favorites are not safe. If you love something unpopular, or something which has seen its popularity waning for a while, you have to come to grips with the fact that any update could be its last. Readers and fans are fearful that the magazine has become too cutthroat, and that the stories aren't being given the time to grow and develop that they deserve, because they've seen some of their favorite young stories get tossed out with the bathwater. And since we are at the mercy of editors at our favorite magazines like Jump, let's take a moment and take a look at the series which may be on the chopping block. Starting with some of your favorites. I'm Zero, this is Kato, and today let's talk about Shounen Jump. The Restful Dragon. Its two heads rise once again. Kato goes beyond. So there are really two ways that manga get cancelled in my experience as a reader of manga for the past dozen years or so. In the first and usual case, a young series doesn't gain enough traction and gets cut off around chapter 21 to 25. Or in what we'll call a soft cancellation, a veteran series loses popularity in favor of newer titles in the magazine, in which case they're given some sort of deadline, like 100 chapters or something. So if we ask ourselves who's likely to get this kind of soft cancellation, we'll be able to anticipate the next big manga to end. There aren't so many series that qualify as big manga in Jump, especially since we're only talking about the weekly stuff, because that would exclude Super and Boruto, which are pretty high profile. We've seen the presumably natural end of The Promised Neverland, Chainsaw Man, and even Dr. Stone recently, and each of those would have been a good candidate to consider. And it doesn't only happen to the big manga, sometimes series like Abyss Rage seem to get a soft cancellation. All of this free real estate in the magazine has led to the introduction of some manga that people seem to be gravitating towards. I will say that Jump has seemingly got better at doing these soft cancellations, because it's not as obvious whether or not it happened to The Promised Neverland or Abyss Rage, compared to a title like Toriko, which obviously suffered from some sort of soft cancellation. And the fact that it happened to Toriko and Bleach sets a precedent for big manga becoming a victim of this phenomenon, even if in Bleach's case it was probably because Kubo had grown weary of being a mangaka at the time. It's worth noting that none of this is new either. The reason there seems to be an uptick in the number of Western fans mourning cancelled Jump manga is only that more of the magazine is available to us than ever before. And that's a great boon for Western fans of Jump. Sure, they won't translate Kingdom for us for some reason, but it feels like we're more included in the magazine than ever before. So although it feels sad, I think we're going to have to embrace the culture of the magazine. We can't really expect them to start giving manga a chance even if it doesn't perform very well. Although I'm a reader, not an editor, I think I can kinda get into their headspace a little. I'll try to think about what would be good for the magazine in pragmatic terms without letting my biased ranking of quality affect my ranking of their survival odds. These manga are serialized in Jump in the first place, so what matters now is popularity, reception, and momentum essentially. You can think of this as the survival scale for Jump. Shout out to H2 Mass. All of that is to say, this video isn't about my wishful thinking, it's about what's actually likely to go. But of course I don't have all of the same info that Jump editors are working with when they make these decisions. That's just a little disclaimer. So let's take a step back and talk about what's recently been cancelled at Jump that caused all of this uproar in the first place. I have a list of stories that seemed promising in their own way but never quite got off the ground at Jump and ended up getting cancelled around the 20th chapter. Let's start with Samurai 8. This one was of interest because it was authored by none other than Masashi Kishimoto, the renowned author of Naruto, one of the most successful stories Jump has seen, period. And being by the same author, it had many of the same strengths as Naruto. A rich, visually striking world with a cool power system, full of memorable allies, mentors, foes. It also had a digital theme going on. It was set in the far future, so the integration of digital processes into physical reality had been completely achieved. So we were given this sprawling, unique world unlike anything in popular manga, the whole thing under the control of one of the medium's greatest artistic minds. And this series lasted 43 chapters before it got axed. This was when I really noticed people starting to say, hey, wait a second. Would Bleach, Naruto, or One Piece even make it if they were in Shounen Jump today? And this is the sentiment that people in the West are feeling about the state of Shueisha. Then we have Build King. This is a series headed by another huge name in manga, Mitsutoshi Shimabukuro, the creator of Toriko. Like Toriko, the main character of Build King is an orange-clad professional warrior of sorts, very reminiscent of Goku. He's set in a world with gorgeous and unimaginable architecture, and there's an intriguing narrative about how all of the greatest constructions in anime history had to have been put together by truly great builders. There's some interesting thematic poignancy going on about the labor of constructing something grand and magnificent. Like, for example, a shonen story which lasts for hundreds of chapters. As someone who read Toriko, I was pretty excited about this title at the time. I thought it had potential to be one of the best written things in Jump. And by the time it got cancelled, Build King had exactly 20 chapters. So people are wondering, if these big names can't even make it in the magazine anymore, how is any manga title of quality supposed to take its time and tell a good story without getting axed? But the answer to this lies in the rise of new young manga stars. Even before that, though, this question betrays a misunderstanding about the life of a mangaka. Every single successful mangaka has a list of successes and failures under their belt. And let's not get it twisted. Samurai 8 and Build King were promising, but they were not truly good. Not only did they not have enough time to reach that point, but Build King in particular didn't even feel especially fresh or new. Them getting cut off early is justifiable when we have titles like Dr. Stone and Chainsaw Man in the magazine. And I would argue that some of the stuff I'll talk about later shows more promise in the early chapters than these titles I've discussed thus far. But then you have the stuff that got axed despite being new, fresh, and interesting for Western fans. I mentioned I Tell C earlier, so let's start there. Mystery is not a new genre to manga, or Jump specifically. We've had our share of detective stories, obviously Death Note springs to mind. Fans of the channel will know that I love all manner of detective stories. Sherlock and Columbo are two of my favorite fictional characters. But if you even just read the first chapter of I Tell C, you'll see how our lovable protagonist sets herself apart from the crowd. A criminal investigator is fun on its own, but a criminal investigator is a whole new level of entertainment. This is someone whose passion for chasing criminals runs so deep she ends up stalking them as she attempts to understand them better. It's a pretty hilarious setup, and the way the narrative explores this idea doesn't disappoint either. On top of that, the actual mysteries are more interesting than in Deranged Detective as well. It's just overall a huge shame that we ended up missing out on more of this series and got Deranged Detective shortly after instead. To wrap up this segment, let's talk about my absolute favorite Jump manga that recently got axed for no reason, Neru, The Way of the Martial Artist. But first, some quick honorable mentions. The Hunters Guild, Red Hood, Ayashimon, and Protect Me Shugamaru are the three most recent cancellations I've noticed. Shugamaru was a funny, silly gag manga. It did some interesting things with collage art, and had a lot of Yu-Gi-Oh! References. Not as forgettable as I initially expected, but it still only made it to 26 chapters. It ended up getting to tell its full story in that time, so it might be worth going back to if you're intrigued. Ayashimon was a really fun Jujutsu Kaisen clone with a protagonist who wants to be just like Jotaro and Goku and all of his favorite tough guy shonen MCs. It actually seemed like it was going for a pretty rich discussion about the depiction of Japanese organized crime in manga, but it only made it to 25 chapters. Not much more to say about it other than that it was gone too soon. And Red Hood was more of a traditional battle shonen, which was also very unique in its setting and power system, much like Build King. It even had very high quality art and top tier waifus. So I actually thought this would not only survive in this volatile magazine, but that it would actually thrive and maybe even become a big name in battle shonen. I was, of course, a comedic fool, and Red Hood didn't even make it to the 20th chapter, getting axed at only chapter 18. But let's get back to Neru. This is the one that really broke my heart and inspired this video. It was a story about martial arts, which should have made it a shoo-in for Shounen Jump. The protagonist and deuteragonist were an interesting duo who could have been great to watch as either lovers or rivals. And the rest of the cast follows their lead and is simultaneously realistic, zany, and unique. I was excited for this story every week. Not because I needed to see what happened next, but just because I wanted to spend more time at this amazing school. And that's what makes an unlucky manga cancellation so painful, really. The connection we have to these stories can get cut off at a moment's notice. I keep making execution jokes because it's really a similar sense of loss to the death of a loved one. You feel it most profoundly when you realize your time with them is now only in the past. I could talk for a long time about this series in particular and how its characters pulled me in, but it's too late. Those things went unsaid for too long. Neru didn't get the chance to bask in that love while it was here. Maybe if it had, it would have been able to endure a little longer. With that in mind, let's look not at the last cancellation, but at the next cancellations. Let's look at the current lineup of Jump. In part 2! That's right, this video ended up being way too long. This first part is only 2/5 of the script, and I barely got this out in time. So we decided to split this one up. That's all for today, though.